In the United States right now, people are very concerned that it's not working. And your sensitivity to structure, I saw, how we say, directed at the challenge of employment in the United States with a recent paper you co-authored for the Council on Foreign Relations. How do you see the challenge of adjusting to these new large economies for the United States, and what's happening internally? What does your work suggest?
Let me preface this, Rob, by saying, this is a conversation that I hope is starting in America that has to do with structure and distribution of income and distribution of employment opportunities and the impact of the evolving structure of the global economy on us. Now, so to kind of help start that discussion, what Sandile Helachwayo and I did is we just went back in the American economy, sector by sector, tried to divide it as best we could into the parts that are directly exposed to the rest of the global economy. We called it the tradable sector. It's goods and services that trade internationally. It's an expanding group. There are things that trade now that didn't trade before because technology's made it possible, and that's an important part of the trend. And then there's a very big part of any economy, including ours, in America that's non-tradable. It's sort of most of government, most of healthcare, most of construction. What we discovered is that America, which has to generate a lot of employment in order to absorb its workforce because of our immigration and our policies and our demographics, actually did a pretty good job. We generated over 27 million jobs in an 18-year period coming up to the start of the crisis in 2008. But virtually all of them, 98%, were in the non-tradable sector. And so when we looked at the tradable sector, we found subparts, finance, variety of kinds of consulting, managing multinational enterprises, computer engineering, and a whole lot of things, that were growing in employment, growing in value added per person, so incomes were probably rising. But when we looked at the manufacturing sectors, then we discovered that the employment, with almost no exceptions, pharmaceuticals I think was the one, were declining in employment, while at the same time growing in value added and so on. And so what appears to me to be going on, although you need really detailed data on global supply chains to prove this definitively, is that what was happening is that the developing countries were getting bigger, expanding their capabilities, moving up value-added chains, deepening the technology base of their economy, and the lower value-added components of these value-added chains were moving offshore. And that's kind of what ought to happen in a global economy. That's what multinational enterprises do in part. They're the architects of these global supply chains, and they're pretty dynamic. But when you netted that whatever was causing it, employment decline in the manufacturing parts of the tradable sector against the ones that were growing, you came out with 2%, almost zero.
Now you and I have talked in the past about the Fung Institute in Hong Kong that INET's good friend Andrew Sheng is heading up, and you're, I believe, the head of the academic advisory board. They're looking at global supply chains, and in essence, I think it would draw question as to the superficial observations on productivity data.
Yeah, Victor's new institute, the Fung Global Institute that Andrew Sheng is heading, has as one of its major first projects trying to shed some light in detail, empirical detail, on these sort of global supply chains, both what they look like and how they're moving. As it's not a static thing. You can't just take a snapshot and assume it's going to stay that way. It's especially true now, Rob, because China is going through the middle income transition, and if they're successful, they will migrate away, most of the very labor intensive, low value added per worker process oriented manufacturing that, we associate with China now. And that's happened before in the other cases that came before in Japan, Korea, Taiwan, a number. So, and, so people wonder if they'll be successful, but if they are, where the global supply chains run through will look very differently 10 years from now than it does today.
But in say, respect to the United States, productivity in the computer sector, if you look at Apple, after much of the low value added has moved offshore, productivity in that sector in the United States looks much higher.
Absolutely.
But if it was called the United Republic of Apple, which incorporated the supply chain as though it were a nation, the productivity gains wouldn't be considered so profound.
No, that's right. So if you take a specific supply chain like Apple's, then you've got high value-added activity that tends to be here, not uniquely in the United States, and there may be productivity gains in that. And then you've got some lower value-added activities that a variety of them, and some of them have remained domestic. Some might even be non-tradable, and you can get productivity gains in that. But the third component, the one you're talking about, is you can raise the productivity gains in the American component simply by taking away the lower value added per person or lower productivity or whatever you want to call it, parts of the supply chain and putting them somewhere else in the global economy. And we have to be very careful about this because, if you ignore that contribution and it turns out to be large, you can think of this as technological progress, here, whereas in fact it's a combination of that and global supply chain.
Outside the cookie cutter of our measuring device.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And with current data, hard and all as the Bureau of Labor Statistics and others work, you can't separate these things.
Yeah.